The airport buzzed like a restless hive. Travelers hurried past, the wheels of their suitcases clicking against the tiled floor. Amid this chaos sat an elderly man on a bench near the departure gate. His brown overcoat was neatly pressed, but his shoes were scuffed, and his gray hair fell untamed over his forehead. He clutched a leather bag tightly, his knuckles pale against its dark surface. For 3 days, he had been there. Passengers came and went, staff changed shifts, and the cleaning crew swept the floors repeatedly. Yet, he didn't board a flight, didn't speak to anyone. His eyes seemed to scan the crowd endlessly, searching, waiting. Something about him made people uneasy. He wasn't just sitting. He was lingering. Before we dive into this story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe. By the third day, airport security took notice. A guard in a crisp navy uniform stood at a distance, watching the man. "Have you seen him eat or drink?" A young officer whispered to his colleague. "No," the other replied. "He just sits there." "What's he waiting for?" The overhead announcement broke their conversation. "Flight 243 to Chicago is now boarding at Gate 7. But the man didn't even flinch. From time to time, he would open the bag and glance at something inside, his face a mix of pain and determination. It was as if whatever lay in that bag held his entire world, or perhaps his entire reason for being there. The guards debated whether to approach him. "It's probably nothing," one said, though his voice lacked conviction. The elderly man's behavior was peculiar but not yet alarming. Yet, that bag, it stirred their curiosity. As a wave of passengers rushed toward Gate 12, the man opened the bag again. From where they stood, the guards couldn't see what was inside, but they could see the way his hands trembled. He pulled something out briefly, just a glimpse, and quickly tucked it back inside. The younger officer frowned. "We need to check that bag." Meanwhile, a flight attendant waiting for her shift break couldn't help but notice the man as well. She had passed him on her way to the lounge several times. Each time, his eyes followed her, not with malice, but with a strange, almost pleading look. "He's been here for 3 days, she overheard a guard saying. Her curiosity piqued. She approached the bench cautiously. "Sir," she said gently, "are you okay? Can I get you something to eat or drink?" The man looked up, his tired eyes filled with gratitude, but he shook his head. "Thank you, miss," he said softly, his voice raspy with age. "I'm fine. Just waiting." "For what?" She pressed, but he only smiled faintly, his gaze drifting back to the crowd. By the evening of the third day, the head of airport security decided it was time to act. A team of 3 officers approached the man cautiously. One spoke first, his tone polite but firm. "Sir, we've noticed you've been here for some time. Is there a problem? Can we assist you?" The man glanced up, his expression calm but guarded. "I'm waiting for someone," he replied simply, "for 3 days." Another officer asked skeptically. The elderly man hesitated, his grip tightening on the bag. "Yes," he said after a pause. "And I'll wait as long as it takes." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a seasoned veteran named Carter, crouched to meet the man's eye level. "Sir," he said gently, "this isn't a place to wait indefinitely. Are you sure there's nothing we can do to help? Or someone we can call for you?" The man's jaw clenched. "No one can help," he said firmly. "I have to do this myself." Carter stood, troubled by the man's cryptic words. He signaled to his colleagues. "Let's check his bag," he said in a low voice, but when they made the request, the man's demeanor changed. He hugged the bag close, shaking his head. "No. It's personal," he said, his voice trembling. "Please. Don't." As the officers tried to reason with him, curious onlookers began to gather. Travelers paused mid-step, whispering among themselves. "What's going on? Did they catch someone dangerous?" The man's refusal to open his bag only added to the tension. Security had no choice but to escalate. Carter stepped aside and radioed for backup. "We've got a situation at Gate 10. Elderly male, uncooperative. Possible threat. Requesting assistance. The words possible threat sent a ripple of unease through the terminal. Mothers clutched their children closer, and passengers edged away from the bench. The man, now visibly distressed, looked around at the crowd. "I'm not a danger," he said softly, though no one seemed to believe him. When backup arrived, the elderly man didn't resist. He stood slowly, his knees wobbling, and handed over the bag without a word. The officers carried it to a secure area, leaving him alone on the bench. The crowd watched intently as the bag was placed on a metal table. A bomb-sniffing dog was brought in, and a technician carefully opened the zipper. Everyone held their breath. Inside was not a weapon, not explosives, but something far more puzzling: a small stack of letters, neatly tied with a ribbon, and a faded photograph of a smiling woman. The security officers stared at the contents of the bag, confusion etched on their faces. The photograph was old, its corners bent with time. In it, a young woman with kind eyes and a radiant smile stood in front of a small house. The letters, yellowed and fragile, looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. Carter carefully picked up the photo, examining it. "Who is she?" he wondered aloud. The elderly man, still seated on the bench, watched their every move. His eyes glistened, not with fear, but with a deep, aching sorrow. "She's my wife," he said quietly, breaking the silence. Or she was. The murmurs in the terminal grew louder. The tension shifted from fear to intrigue. Carter approached the man again, the photograph still in hand. "Sir, why have you been waiting here with this?" he asked gently. The elderly man took a deep breath, his frail chest rising and falling as if the weight of the story he carried was too much. She told me she'd meet me here," he began, his voice trembling. 50 years ago, before she passed." The crowd, which had been brimming with suspicion moments ago, fell silent. Even the guards, trained to be stoic, couldn't hide their surprise. The elderly man's hands trembled as he gestured toward the letters. "These are all the letters we wrote to each other. She kept them safe, and when she got sick, she gave them back to me," she said. His voice cracked, and he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "She said that one day, when it was time, I should come here. To this airport. To wait for her." A woman in the crowd gasped softly. A man murmured, "But why here?" Carter knelt down again, his tone softer now. "Sir, I'm sorry for your loss, but why this airport? Why now?" The man managed a weak smile, though it was filled with pain. "This is where we first met," he explained. "I was a young soldier, about to be deployed overseas. She was a ticket clerk. I didn't have much time, but when I saw her, I knew. She was the one." The listeners leaned closer, captivated by the unfolding story. The elderly man continued, his voice steadier now. "We promised each other that no matter what happened, this airport would always be our meeting place. It's where everything began. And where, one day, it would end." The letters, the photograph, the wait, it all began to make sense. But one question lingered in everyone's mind: why now? The elderly man seemed to sense it, and his gaze dropped to the floor. "I couldn't come sooner," he admitted. "Life. It got in the way. I was scared, too. Scared of facing this place alone. But now, at my age, I can't afford to wait any longer." His words hung heavy in the air. A tear slipped down his cheek. "I just wanted to say goodbye, to feel her presence here one last time." Carter exchanged a glance with the younger officer, who handed him one of the letters. "May we read it?" he asked. The elderly man hesitated, then nodded slowly. Carter unfolded the letter with care, the paper crinkling softly. The handwriting was delicate, almost poetic. He read aloud, "My dearest James, every day without you feels like a year. I dream of the day I can see you at the gate, your arms open wide, welcoming me home. Until then, I'll carry you in my heart." The crowd, now entirely silent, hung on every word. James, the elderly man, bowed his head, his lips moving in a silent prayer, the terminal had transformed from a bustling hub of travelers to a circle of strangers bound by one man's story. A mother with a young child stepped forward. "James," she said gently, "your love story. It's beautiful." James looked up at her, his eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. "It was more than a story. It was my life." The child, no older than 6, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, is his wife coming back?" The question, innocent yet heartbreaking, made everyone pause. James smiled sadly at the boy. "Not in the way you're thinking, son. But she's always with me. Here." He tapped his chest. As the letters and photograph were carefully returned to James, Carter addressed the crowd. "This man isn't a threat. He's a reminder," he said. "A reminder that love, true love, doesn't fade, even after decades, even after loss." The passengers began to disperse, many wiping their eyes as they returned to their travels. But a few stayed behind, unwilling to leave James alone. The flight attendant from earlier brought him a cup of tea. "On the house," she said with a smile. James took it gratefully, his hands still trembling. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for listening. For understanding." As James sipped the tea, the hum of the terminal returned, though quieter than before. The young officer who had doubted him earlier approached with a question. "Mr. James," he began, hesitating, "do you believe? Do you truly believe she's here, in some way?" James looked up, his eyes soft yet unwavering. "I don't believe," he said slowly. "I know." His gaze wandered to the ceiling, as if searching for something beyond the visible. "Every breeze I've felt since I came here. It's her touch. Every faint scent of roses in the air. It's her perfume. She's here. She promised she would be." The officer nodded, his skepticism melting into a quiet respect. "You must have loved her a lot," he murmured. James chuckled faintly, though it sounded more like a sigh. "Son, a lot doesn't begin to cover it. She was my world." Among the remaining onlookers was a man in a sharp business suit. He had been leaning against a pillar, quietly observing the unfolding events. Now, he stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor. "I'm a journalist," the man announced, holding out a card. "I've seen a lot of stories in my time, but yours is something special." James looked at the card but didn't take it. "I'm not a story," he said firmly. "I'm just an old man honoring a promise." The journalist smiled. "That's precisely what makes it worth telling. The world could use a story like yours right now." He hesitated, then added, "Maybe I can help you find what, or who, you're waiting for." James shook his head, his expression kind but resolute. "Thank you, son, but this is something I have to do alone." As the day turned into night, the airport lights cast long shadows across the terminal. James sat back on the bench, clutching the photograph tightly. He closed his eyes, and the noise of the terminal faded away. In his mind, he was no longer at the airport. He was back in 1965, standing in line for his ticket. The young woman behind the counter, Margaret, had the brightest smile he had ever seen. "Where are you headed, soldier?" she had asked, her voice like music. To the unknown, he had replied, attempting a brave face. "But I'd rather stay here. With you." Margaret had blushed, but she didn't look away. "Then come back to me," she whispered. "Promise?" "I promise," James had said. A sudden noise brought James back to the present. The flight attendant had returned, this time carrying a blanket. "You should rest, Mr. James," she said softly. James smiled up at her, his face weary but grateful. "Thank you, dear, but I don't think I can sleep. Margaret's here somewhere. I feel her." The attendant hesitated. "Mr. James. If you could say one thing to her now, what would it be?" James didn't need to think. "I'd say I'm sorry. Sorry I didn't come sooner. Sorry I wasn't brave enough to face this place without her. And I'd tell her. I never stopped loving her. Not for a second." As the terminal quieted for the night, the airport seemed to transform. The bustling chaos of the day gave way to a serene, almost sacred stillness. The echoes of announcements and distant footsteps created an eerie but comforting rhythm. James sat alone, his thoughts drifting. He could almost hear her laughter in the gentle hum of the air conditioning, feel her hand in the warmth of the blanket the attendant had brought. He closed his eyes again, whispering, "Margaret, if you're here, please give me a sign." The room seemed to hold its breath. Then, a faint sound, a bell, perhaps, or the chime of a distant intercom, rang out. James opened his eyes, a tear slipping down his cheek. "I knew it," he murmured. "I knew you wouldn't let me wait forever." Driven by a sudden surge of energy, James stood up, the photograph still clutched in his hand. He turned to Carter, who had been keeping an eye on him from a distance. "Gate 14, James said, his voice stronger than it had been in days. Carter frowned. "Sir, Gate 14 hasn't been in use for years. It's part of the old terminal." James nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. "That's where we met. That's where she'll be." Carter hesitated, then motioned for another officer to follow. "Let's take him there," he said. As they walked toward the abandoned gate, the atmosphere grew heavier. The lights flickered, and the sounds of the active terminal faded into silence. James's heart pounded with every step. He could see it now, Gate 14, just as it had been all those years ago. The same worn seats, the same faded sign. He stopped in front of the gate, staring at it as if it were a portal to another world. "This is it," he whispered. "This is where she said we'd meet." Gate 14 loomed before them, a relic of a bygone era. Dust had settled over the counters, and the faded lettering on the sign above barely read Gate 14. James ran his fingers over the counter's edge, feeling its worn surface. "This was where she worked," he murmured. Her smile could light up this entire place. Carter and the other officer exchanged uneasy glances. The stillness of the area felt almost unnatural, as if the space itself was frozen in time. Suddenly, the faintest echo of laughter broke the silence. James froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling. Carter nodded slowly. "It's probably just the old speakers," he suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. James reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a yellowed envelope. He unfolded the letter inside with care, as if it might crumble in his hands. "It's the last thing she wrote to me," he explained, his voice heavy with emotion. "She said, if you ever feel lost, come back here. I'll be waiting." Carter leaned closer, reading the words over James's shoulder. The handwriting was elegant, each stroke filled with tenderness. "Do you think she meant here, at Gate 14? Carter asked hesitantly. James nodded, his gaze fixed on the empty gate. "I know she did. And I've finally kept my promise." As James stood there, clutching the letter, a sudden gust of wind swept through the gate. It was strange, there were no open windows, no logical explanation for it. The breeze carried a faint scent of roses. So delicate yet unmistakable, James inhaled sharply. "Margaret," he whispered, his eyes glistening with tears. "That's her perfume." The officers looked around, visibly uneasy. The moment felt charged with something they couldn't explain. Carter placed a hand on James's shoulder. "Sir, whatever this is, we're with you." James smiled faintly. "Thank you, son. But this is something only I can face." The lights in the area flickered again, plunging Gate 14 into near darkness. James didn't move. Instead, he closed his eyes, focusing on the sounds around him, and then, he heard it, James. The voice was soft, barely audible, but it was unmistakably hers. His eyes snapped open, scanning the empty space. "Margaret?" he called out, his voice breaking. "Is that you?" Carter stepped forward, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. But there was nothing, only silence and emptiness. James moved toward a bench near the gate, the very spot where he and Margaret had shared their first conversation. He sat down, his hands trembling. "This bench," he said softly. "We used to sit here during her breaks. She'd talk about her dreams, her favorite songs. She loved the sound of rain on a tin roof. He paused, his voice faltering. I can almost hear her now. Carter and the other officer stood back, giving him space. The younger officer whispered, "Do you think she's really here, somehow?" Carter didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on James, whose face glowed with a mixture of sorrow and hope. As James sat on the bench, a faint light began to glow near the gate. It wasn't from the overhead fixtures, it was softer, warmer, almost like candlelight. James stood, his heart pounding. "Margaret?" He called again, his voice filled with longing. The light flickered, then grew stronger, illuminating the faded lettering on the gate sign. James reached out a hand, as if trying to touch it. Carter stepped forward cautiously. "Mr. James. What do you see?" James didn't answer. His focus was entirely on the light, his eyes shining with unshed tears. The light faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving James standing in the dimly lit terminal. He lowered his hand, his shoulders sagging. "It's gone," he whispered, his voice heavy with disappointment. Carter placed a comforting hand on his arm. "Maybe it's not gone," he said gently. "Maybe it's just leading you to the next step." James turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "The next step?" "Yes. Margaret always said life was about moving forward, even when it felt impossible." He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Let's keep going." James stepped closer to gate 14, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. Suddenly, a sound broke through the silence, a soft, melodic laughter. It was faint, like a memory drifting on the wind. But James froze. That laugh. He whispered, his eyes wide. "It's hers." Carter turned sharply, his flashlight scanning the area. "I didn't hear anything, Mr. James." "Are you sure?" James nodded, his voice firm. "I could never forget it. She laughed like that when I told her I'd marry her one day. Said I was too shy to ever ask properly." He chuckled, tears pooling in his eyes. "And she was right. I had to work up the courage for months." As James stood lost in thought, an older janitor appeared, pushing a cart laden with cleaning supplies. He paused when he saw the group near gate 14. "You folks shouldn't be here," the janitor said, his voice gruff. "This part of the terminal's been closed for years." James turned to him, a spark of hope in his eyes. "Do you remember anything about this gate? A young woman who worked here. Margaret?" The janitor's brow furrowed as he scratched his head. "Margaret. Margaret. Oh. I think I do. Sweet girl. Always wore a flower in her hair. She was here back when this gate was the busiest in the terminal." James smiled softly. "That's her. She was my Margaret." The janitor leaned on his mop, his eyes softening as he spoke. "I remember one thing about her. She used to sit right there on that bench after her shift, writing letters. Said she was waiting for someone special." James swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was waiting for me." The janitor tilted his head. "You're the soldier, aren't you? The one she talked about? She always said, one day, he'll walk through that gate, and everything will be right again." James's heart clenched. "She waited for me. All this time." The janitor dug into his cart, pulling out a rusty set of keys. "I don't know if this will help, but there's a locker room back there. It's where employees kept their personal things. Might still be something of hers in there." James's hand trembled as he took the keys. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Carter stepped forward. "I'll go with you, Mr. James. Let's see what we can find." Together, they walked toward the old employee area, the weight of the past pressing down on them. James clutched the keys tightly, each step feeling like a step closer to Margaret. The employee area was dimly lit, the air heavy with dust and nostalgia. Rows of lockers lined the walls, each marked with faded nameplates. James scanned them until he found one with her name, M. Turner. His fingers hovered over the lock, his heart pounding. "This is it," he whispered, Carter handed him a flashlight, and James inserted the key with trembling hands. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open, revealing a small collection of items, an old sweater, a photo of a couple dancing, and a stack of letters tied with a ribbon. James picked up the letters, his hands shaking as he untied the ribbon. The top letter bore his name in Margaret's elegant handwriting. He unfolded it carefully, his breath catching as he began to read, "My dearest James, if you're reading this, then you've come back, just like you promised. I knew you would. Every day, I've waited for you, believing in the love we shared. If I'm not here to meet you, know that I've never truly left. My heart has always been yours, and it always will be." The words blurred as tears filled James's eyes. "She never gave up on me," he choked out. Among the items in the locker was a faded photograph tucked inside a small frame. It showed James and Margaret, arms wrapped around each other, laughing under a blossoming cherry tree. James traced the outline of her face with his thumb. "This was the day we promised to always find our way back to each other," he murmured. Carter glanced at the photo, his expression softening. "You made it, Mr. James. You're here." James nodded, holding the photo close. "I just wish I could tell her I kept my promise." As they left the locker room, the janitor stopped them. "I don't know if this means anything, but Margaret left something behind a long time ago. Said it was for someone special." He handed James a small, leather-bound book. The cover was embossed with Margaret's initials, and inside were pages filled with pressed flowers and handwritten notes. James flipped through the book, his chest tightening with each memory it contained. On the last page was a single line, "Love is eternal, James. Wherever you are, I am too." James sat back on the bench at gate 14, clutching the book and photograph. The weight of regret was slowly lifting, replaced by a deep sense of peace. Carter sat beside him. "What now, Mr. James?" James smiled faintly, looking toward the gate as if expecting to see Margaret walk through it. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think I've found what I was looking for. She's been with me all along." As James sat in the quiet terminal, a strange feeling washed over him. It was as if Margaret's spirit was there, sitting beside him, holding his hand. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Margaret, if you can hear me, I kept my promise. I came back to you." The air seemed to grow warmer, and James thought he heard the faintest whisper, "I knew you would." Carter glanced at him, noticing the change in his expression. "You okay, Mr. James?" James nodded, a small smile on his face. "I think she's still here, in her own way." James decided to explore the terminal further. Carter stayed by his side, flashlight in hand, as they wandered through the long-abandoned gate areas. Dust-covered signs and faded posters spoke of a time long past. One poster caught James's attention. It advertised a charity dance event from decades ago. "Margaret and I loved dancing," James said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "She'd always drag me onto the floor, even when I swore I had two left feet." Carter chuckled. "Sounds like she brought out the best in you." "She did," James replied softly. As they continued exploring, Carter's flashlight beam revealed a small door partially hidden behind a broken vending machine. "What's this?" Carter muttered, pushing the machine aside. The door creaked open, revealing a tiny room filled with old airport memorabilia. In the corner stood a bulletin board covered in photos, postcards, and notes. James's breath caught when he saw Margaret's handwriting on one of the postcards. It read, "To the one who stole my heart, wherever you are, come back to me. I'll wait forever if I have to." James's fingers trembled as he touched the postcard. "She left this for me." James studied the bulletin board, taking in the various mementos. It was as if time had stopped in this small room, preserving moments that had long since faded from memory. Carter examined a stack of old records in the corner. "This place must have been used for lost and found or something. Looks like they just left everything behind when the gate closed." James nodded, his eyes lingering on Margaret's postcard. "She must have spent so much time here, waiting for me. She believed I'd come back." "And you did." Carter reminded him gently. In the corner of the room, James noticed a small wooden chest with a rusty padlock. The initials MT were carved into the lid. James's heart raced as he knelt before it. This has to be hers. Carter handed him the janitor's set of keys. After a few tries, James found the one that fit. The lock clicked open, and the lid creaked as he lifted it. Inside were more letters, a music box, and a neatly folded scarf. The music box caught James's attention. He wound it up, and a familiar tune began to play, a song he and Margaret had danced to under the stars. As the delicate tune played, James closed his eyes, and the memory came rushing back. It was a warm summer evening. And Margaret had convinced him to dance in a meadow, the stars their only witnesses. "You're terrible at this," she had teased, laughing as he stumbled over his feet. "But you still love me," he had replied, spinning her around. The memory brought a bittersweet smile to James's face. "She never stopped loving me," he murmured. Carter stood silently, letting the moment sink in. The haunting melody of the music box filled the room, carrying James back to a time when love felt eternal. Holding the music box and scarf, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. Margaret's unwavering belief in him, even after all these years, gave him strength he hadn't felt in decades. "I came here to find her," James said firmly. "And now I realize she never really left. She's been with me all along." Carter placed a hand on James's shoulder. "What do you want to do now, Mr. James?" James looked around the room, his gaze steady. "I want to honor her. I'll make sure her story isn't forgotten." The janitor appeared again as James and Carter exited the hidden room. "Find what you were looking for?" he asked, his tone softer than before. James nodded, holding up the music box. "I found more than I ever hoped. Margaret was extraordinary. People should know about her." The janitor smiled faintly. "You've got the heart of a storyteller. Maybe that's what this place needs, a way to remember what it used to be." James's eyes lit up. Maybe it's time this terminal had a new purpose. James and Carter returned to the main terminal, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. James turned to Carter with a spark of determination. "What if we turned this place into something meaningful? A space for people to remember and reconnect?" Carter raised an eyebrow. "You're talking about restoring the terminal?" "Not just restoring it," James said. "Transforming it. A memorial for all the people who've waited, hoped, and loved here. Including Margaret." Carter considered this, a smile tugging at his lips. "I think she'd like that." James sat in a quiet corner of the terminal, sketching ideas on a notepad Carter had brought. "This place could be more than a memorial," James said, his voice steady with newfound purpose. "It could be a haven. A place for stories, for memories, for people searching for hope." Carter nodded, leaning over to look at the sketches. "A museum of connections, maybe? People leave behind memories in airports all the time. Lost luggage, forgotten love notes, even postcards like Margaret's." James's eyes glimmered. "Yes, and it starts with her story. Margaret's waiting becomes the heart of it all." The next morning, James and Carter met with the airport management. A skeptical-looking woman in a crisp suit greeted them. "Mr. James, I hear you've been here for days. What exactly are you proposing?" James spoke with passion, his voice unwavering. "This terminal has been forgotten, just like so many people's stories. I want to bring it back to life, not as an airport, but as a place where people can reconnect with what matters. My wife, Margaret, waited here for me for years. Her story deserves to be told." The woman softened, intrigued despite herself. "You're talking about a historical preservation project?" "Not just history," James corrected gently. "Humanity." Word of James's idea spread, and soon the community began to rally behind him. Former airport workers donated memorabilia, travelers shared old photographs, and locals offered their time to help clean and restore the terminal. Carter stood beside James as volunteers scrubbed graffiti off walls and polished dusty windows. "Looks like you've started something bigger than either of us imagined," Carter said. James smiled, watching as a young boy carried a box of vintage signs. It's not just for Margaret anymore. It's for everyone who's ever waited for someone they loved. As volunteers dug through storage rooms and forgotten closets, they unearthed treasures that told stories of their own. A suitcase filled with handwritten letters. An old pilot's logbook. A diary belonging to a traveler stranded during a snowstorm. James carefully examined each item, feeling their weight. "Every one of these has a story," he said. "Margaret's story is the thread that ties them together, but these stories add the color." Carter chuckled. "You're turning into quite the curator, Mr. James." "Just a man keeping a promise," James replied, holding up an old photo of a smiling couple. One section of the terminal was dedicated entirely to Margaret. It featured her postcard, the music box, and photographs of her taken during her years of waiting. James stood in the middle of the display, feeling both pride and sorrow. This was her sanctuary, he whispered. She turned her waiting into something beautiful. Carter placed a hand on James's shoulder. "And now, you're doing the same." James nodded, his heart swelling. "This is her legacy. She taught me that love is patient, enduring, and worth every moment." As the project neared completion, James and the team planned a grand opening event. Flyers were printed, inviting people to come and share their own airport stories. "We'll have storytelling sessions, music, and a space where people can leave their own mementos," Carter suggested. James smiled. "And I'll tell Margaret's story. It's the reason all of this is happening." The thought of speaking to a crowd made James nervous, but he knew it was the right thing to do. "She waited so long for me," he murmured. It's time the world knew why. On the eve of the grand opening, James wandered through the restored terminal, now filled with life and light. The once abandoned space was now vibrant with colors, sounds, and the buzz of excitement. He stopped at Margaret's corner, running his fingers over the postcard she had left behind. "Tomorrow's the big day, love," he whispered. "I hope I've made you proud." Carter approached with a smile. "Big speech tomorrow, huh?" James nodded, his heart pounding at the thought. "I just want to do her justice." "You already have," Carter replied warmly. The grand opening drew a large crowd. Families, travelers, and former airport staff gathered, their faces alight with curiosity and anticipation. James stood at the podium, his hands trembling slightly as he held Margaret's postcard. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steadying as he spoke. "This terminal is more than a building. It's a place where love, hope, and memories live." He paused, holding up the postcard. "My wife, Margaret, waited here for me for years. She believed in love, even when it seemed impossible. And her story has inspired all of this." The audience listened intently, many moved to tears. After the speech, people began exploring the terminal, leaving their own mementos and sharing their stories. The terminal transformed into a living museum of human connection. James watched as a young couple read Margaret's postcard, their hands entwined. "She's still bringing people together," he said to Carter, a smile on his face. Carter nodded. "You've created something incredible, Mr. James. This place is alive again." James felt a deep peace settle over him. Margaret's waiting had not been in vain, and now, her love and patience would continue to inspire others for generations. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and know that patience is a universal language that speaks to the heart of every human being. In James and Margaret's story, we see how waiting, though difficult, becomes a testament to the power of love and resilience. Their unwavering belief in each other reminds us that the things worth waiting for often define the best parts of our lives. Every person has their own terminal, a place or moment where they wait for something they deeply long for. It could be love, forgiveness, success, or even peace. James's journey shows us that even in the most uncertain moments, we can transform waiting into something meaningful, not through idle time, but through purpose, hope, and connection with others. Ask yourself, what am I waiting for? How can I turn this waiting into a legacy of love and meaning? And always remember, the beauty of life isn't just in the arrival, it's in the moments we create along the way. Be present. Be patient. And believe that your story matters, just as James and Margaret's did, because love, hope, and human connection are never wasted. they're the ties that hold us together.